Hey folks, this is Marcel Ardans, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who plays bluegrass.
So my guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Marcel Ardans from Lessons With Marcel YouTube channel, which I'm sure you all know about. Not the first time we've chatted, but I'm really looking forward to this one. Marcel, welcome back.
Hey, how you doing, man?
Yeah, good. Back. Thanks for coming back. This is a really interesting one. This one sort of came out of nowhere, really. I did a little episode around Tony Rice's birthday and just put together a compilation of things people had said about him from the podcast. And Marcel just messaged after that. And I said, just sort of off the cuff, I've been looking through your tabs on your website, and there's a huge amount of stuff from Tony Rice, but there's also a lot of Billy Strings, a lot of Molly Tuttle. Do you fancy having a chat about those players? And he was like, yeah, great. Can we let's have a chat about them, about their style, what makes them them. And he said, can we also add Trey Hensley to that list? Because I love Trey, and I'd like to talk about him too. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to have a chat through those four players. And we're going to start with Billy Strings, who is just everywhere at the moment and is inventive and is fresh and yet authentic and very much divides opinion. And I think it'd be just, I'm so looking forward to this conversation just to learn some stuff, because Marcel spent so many hours transcribing these guys' music. He's got some real insight into sort of what makes their style theirs.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit it on the head already when you said he divides opinion, right? Billy Strings is an interesting player for a lot of reasons. I do think that his whole catalog, if you look across his whole career, I think you can find something that you like, because he's certainly done more traditional stuff, and he's certainly done like more progressive stuff. And I think depending on the bluegrass musician you're talking to, they probably have a favorite era of Billy already, even though he's so young, right? His career isn't decades long yet.
It's really interesting, because I used to be Billy's mandolin player, Jared Walker, a while ago, and he talked about the first few gigs that he did with Billy, and he said they were simultaneously the most traditional and the most progressive thing he's ever done, which is quite a balancing act, you know.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. That sounds kind of right on the money for Billy. I think that if you listen to Billy's early material, it's really easy to see how influenced by Doc Watson he is. It's basically all Doc Watson licks. And coming from someone who's transcribed a lot of Doc Watson and a lot of Billy, what's interesting is he doesn't always get it note for note. Right. So even in the beginning area, when it's really close to Doc's playing, he's not playing exactly what Doc played. He's not grabbing it that perfectly, which means that he's already developing a little bit of a personal voice, right? He's like Doc Watson-ish.
Yeah.
I think that one of the like most obvious licks, and this is interesting to me, coming from people who are maybe more familiar with Billy and less familiar with Doc Watson. There's a lot of new fans in bluegrass from Billy. And so there's kind of been this evolution where a lick like this, we associate with Doc Watson. You can hear Doc do that in like Black Mountain Rag. You can hear him do it in just a ton of songs. He plays Beaumont Rag, right? Somewhere he includes this minor to major third that's split across two strings, right? So they ring against each other. And Billy was, still is, but especially in his early material, is really fascinated with that lick. He does it all the time. He does it in G as well. So people will probably peg a lick like this as kind of a Billy Strings thing. And you can hear that grind against those two notes. And it's not, I wouldn't call it a Billy Strings thing per se. I would think that it's just it's a really smart bite from Doc Watson. You know, he's just referencing his hero over and over again every time he plays that lick.
And he loves to find those and sort of hang on them for a while as well. In fact, like, he repeats notes quite a lot, doesn't he? He'll sort of hang on one note or hang on those sort of semitone sort of gaps quite a lot as a sort of a point of tension or setting something up so he can go somewhere else.
Yeah, totally. And that's kind of like that's like a very early bluegrass move. If you listen to players like George Shuffler and Bill Napier, or even pre-bluegrass players, you hear a lot of repeated notes. And that's not something you hear in the modern era, right? In the modern era, you hear like runs where it's constantly a different note and every eighth note is filled. That kind of thing. And then if you listen to older breaks, you'll hear more like, right? They like really will hammer home these melody notes over and over again. So yeah. Billy Strings is kind of a, it's almost like this. The natural progression of bluegrass guitar went from like early players, Bill Napier, George Shuffler, right? Early bluegrass lead guitar players. And, Don Reno did like some rockabilly stuff. There's all kinds of these different interpretations of what bluegrass guitar are. And none of them are really, like specific. None of them is like, oh, that's what guitar does. Everyone's kind of figuring out a different thing. Bill Napier does a lot of the repeated note. George Shuffler does a lot of cross picking. Once again, Don Reno does a lot of the rockabilly kind of thing. And if you get all the way up to the 60s, you get someone like Tony Rice, and it's like, oh, this is what guitar does. And Billy Strings is like the, I don't want to say he's the anti-Tony Rice or anything, but he kind of took everything in a different direction. It's kind of like steampunk or something, where they're like, hey, what if everything was like made out of copper and, cogs and steam power? And Billy Strings kind of did that. He took all of these early bluegrass guitar styles and made that progressive, as opposed to following the natural evolution, which is, I think, really, really cool. Who else has done that? No one.
Yeah, totally. And, we'll come on to talk about other players and Tony Rice in a bit, but there's definitely a Tony Rice sort of influence runs through so much of bluegrass guitar now. And to hear, like, and not just the sort of the licks, but also sort of Billy does a lot of cross picking as well. And
right.
And he talks about that actually, and sort of I've heard him talk about it on stage, but he loves the traditional nature of what Jared Walker brings on mandolin, because he's uses a lot of double stops, a lot of tremolo, also consciously doesn't play super clean. He's not like a Sierra Hull, and I think that is an element of that in Billy's band, a sort of a real rootsy feel, however they take it and however far off that they might go. There's an element of really wanting to ground it in that.
Yeah, it's a funny balance that you strike in bluegrass where, not to be too much of a doomsayer, but the traditionalism is kind of a lie, right? Bluegrass is, by its very definition, a progressive genre. It comes out of 1945, right? Bill Monroe's the guy. He gets all these instruments together, and they all play a certain way. And he even dictated, like, oh, maybe we could have accordion. No, I don't like accordion. Right? Bill Monroe listened to the dobro and was like, dobro isn't part of it. Bill Monroe listened to like lead guitar. He was talking to Doc Watson, like, hey, should Doc Watson join the Bluegrass Boys? And he was like, no, Doc, I don't think you're right. So Bill Monroe did have a really kind of progressive guiding hand. So it's funny that we look back at Bill Monroe as traditionalism. And like you're saying about Jared's mandolin playing, you can see that as traditionalism, but it's actually, at least for that time, it was very progressive.
Yeah.
And so where a bluegrass band decides to draw that line is kind of arbitrary, right? There's some bands out there that think traditionalism, is this 1945 sound. Maybe people are, I don't want to say this, but maybe they're a little sloppier or something, right? Maybe it's less clean. Or other people draw that line and say, like, no, this 1960s era is like, this is what bluegrass is supposed to sound like. Or other people draw that line like the 1980s. They're like, bluegrass album band. That's real bluegrass. That's what feels like traditionalism to them. And that it's arbitrary, I guess is the word, right? You draw that line wherever you want. And I think Billy has done an interesting thing because he's kind of drawn that line in multiple places. It's a very progressive act, but he references a lot of very traditional bluegrass.
Yeah, and there seems to be a definite sense of him being very aware that his audience is not a bluegrass audience, and also not a bluegrass audience. So if he plays a song that would be known to a bluegrass audience, he goes out of his way to point out where it came from, so that people who don't know the history will go and check it out. He's not doing it to sort of say that he's doing it specifically to say, go and check this out. This is where it came from. Yeah,
exactly. I think that's, probably the best thing that's happened for the genre in forever. In that a lot of times, I think when bluegrass, pops off again, it's kind of exciting again. It's kind of based on this traditionalism lie for instance, the Oh Brother Where Art Thou soundtrack for people that were alive during that. I'm sure some of you were like us.
Yeah.
That was a big boom, right? Everyone started playing like traditional music when that movie came out and that soundtrack dropped. And yeah, I think there was a little bit of like disingenuity kind of buried in that, where everyone was like, oh, this is what American music is. This is what traditional stuff is. The music from that album is from a ton of different decades, right? It's a pretty good spread of sources and types of genre and stuff like that. So it's always funny when people point at that record and they're like, it's a bluegrass record. Well, it's kind of not. Some of it's old time. Some of it's like much more gospel. Some of it has this like field holler kind of vibe. They're different things.
Yeah, very, very little of it is a straight bluegrass album. It's true.
And the another big boom for everyone was like the Old Crow Medicine Show, Double Mix 3, the sort of wagon wheel generation, which I think I'm part of. All of those people that came in were like, oh, this is traditional music. This is what it is. And it wasn't really that. So I love that when Billy comes on stage, he's like, oh, this is from this artist, or this is how I learned this. Instead of saying, oh, this is traditional American music. This is just what it is, right? He doesn't blanket statement say that. He's like, no, let me tell you the specifics.
Yeah, and I think that's really cool because there's an element of like there's sort of freedom about very much wanting to root things and reference things and be part of a tradition, and also just entirely do his thing. Because there's something like I saw Billy live for the first time this year, and the first time was in a really small venue, and it felt more like a traditional sort of bluegrass show. And then the second time was in not even a big venue, but a bigger venue, and they did the full on kind of face melt Billy Strings experience. And yeah, it reminded me very much of watching Neil Young play with Crazy Horse, in that the band is sort of there to get him to a point that he can go somewhere other than where he started off. And the audience play a part in that as well, particularly like Billy Strings show, the really vocal, loud, engaged audience. And it's almost like he wants to go on a journey, and you're welcome to come with him, but you need to help him get there. And so it's about energy as much as anything else.
It is, yeah. And I think he achieves that with his guitar playing, using a lot of like jam band and rock and roll tricks that bluegrass isn't saturated with yet. And so it has this kind of new modern sound. One of the things that he does a lot are these repeating licks. And that kind of goes with that conversation we were having earlier, where modern bluegrass players, the template is to play different notes over and over again, right? It's this kind of like a snake that leads up and down the fretboard. And Billy doesn't do that a lot, right? We get a lot of repeating licks, where, we'll get like, kind of these rock and roll, like, or like the Jimmy Page one. Billy isn't afraid of including those, whereas a normal bluegrass musician would be like, that's not bluegrass. I can't repeat the phrase over and over again. But when you put those into a normal bluegrass line, they feel great. Whoops. But yeah, that's the point, right?
Yeah, and he doesn't. He likes to leave a gap as well, and sort of accent offbeats and make things. There's a willingness to make things quite angular at times as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you kind of in some of those cross-picking lines too. This one that he does a lot. That kind of thing. That kind of stuff that he does is very interesting. And like you said, it feels very angular, right? The pattern is in threes. It's not really sitting with the eighth note perfectly. And then there's a bunch of dissonance in that like root note, major seven, dominant seventh, up and down, back and forth in different patterns. It's very cool. And he'll repeat that, for like 4 measures and just let you kind of like sink into this weird, unsure space.
Yeah. And I think it's sort of, it can be a way of pivoting from one thing into another thing and kind of just changing the energy level or shifting a gear or just making something stretch out beyond the traditional forms of a bluegrass song.
Yeah. You can imagine Billy kind of breaking multiple rules in a row. Maybe we're doing that angular thing. Maybe we're repeating a note. We're referencing tradition now. Doc Watson. that would be a very like Billy Strings thing to do, and it's kind of got everything we just talked about wrapped up in it.
And I think one of the things this is a thing that maybe divides people too, and he sort of does what Chris Thile does playing mandolin, in that his physical movements, which may look a bit random, it looks like they're often designed to point something out in the music you may have missed. He's almost directing your attention to what he's playing by the way he's moving his body. He's sort of going, look at this.
Yeah,
I find that really
right.
Interesting.
Yeah, you see that in those repeating patterns where sometimes they don't fit squarely in time, right? If you imagine there's like eight notes in a measure, if he's repeating an idea that only has 5 notes in it, well, that idea, those aren't going to divide evenly, right? The idea is going to be sort of on the beat, off the beat, over and over again. Sometimes you'll see him, rock his body with his own personal pattern as opposed to the pattern that the band is establishing, right? He's like pointing out, feel how interesting this sits with the beat, and he'll want you to experience that rather than to experience the groove you've been experiencing all along. Totally.
And do you find, I know it's very easy when you talk about like any instrumentalist, but guitarist particularly, it's easy to think about their lead playing when you talk about their style, but often like rhythm playing is as much than the choices that people make and the way they weave in and out, and that's more obvious with some players than others. And I wonder if you had any particular thoughts about Billy's rhythm playing. We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings guitars are hand-built from the Sound Up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month, and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com.
Billy kind of plays that like, maybe not exactly, but kind of in the same vein of like the Jimmy Martin rhythm. Like it's very heavy-handed, it's very forceful, and it's completely different from the modern aesthetic too, right? A lot of modern players have gone away from this heavy-handed traditional rhythm. They're playing kind of this floaty, like Tony Rice kind of thing, right? And Billy doesn't do that. Billy plays it very straight ahead, which is very interesting. It's also a shame to talk about because, there's not a ton there to talk about because it is so straight ahead. I think what's more interesting about Billy's rhythm is maybe that he's okay with presenting different grooves. So not everything is this bluegrass backbeat sort of boom chuck. Not everything is that. He's got a ton of songs that he's recorded that don't have that groove, and I love that. Maybe people who know me know that I love that. If you listen to my record, I don't think there's a single bluegrass chop on it.
Yeah, and you can hear sort of other influences coming through, not just in like the way he plays rhythm, like you say, but in some of the note choices as well, with sort of flat fifths and things. There's a clear like metal influence in his playing as well.
Oh yeah,
and you've sort of heard him talk about the fact he gets as energized listening to Slayer as he does listening to fast bluegrass, and and it's a bit of this. He's not the only player we're talking about tonight who's got that kind of influence in him as well, because we're going to come on and talk about Trey Hensley in a minute, and he's said very much the same sort of thing. And there does seem to be a bit of a strange Venn diagram of bluegrass and metal where there's quite a few people in the middle.
But there was a time when I was at a gas station, and I happened to have my guitar, in my case, and I was right next to a guy who also had his guitar in the case. Wild, right? And and he had like a coffin case, like they make those for like BC Rich guitars, some real metalhead thing, right? And so I asked him, I was like, oh, what you got in there? And we ended up talking about it. And I want to say they make those coffin cases for Warlocks. I don't know. Maybe that's what he had. But anyway, I was like, oh, I play bluegrass. I have, a D, whatever. I don't remember what guitar I had. And so we ended up talking, and we were like showing each other like what picks we use. We were talking about like the alternate picking technique. And we had this whole talk in the gas station where, just kind of our whole worlds overlapped, me and this metal guitar player at the 7-Eleven.
I think there's a certain appreciation of sort of energy and technique that goes into both of them, but they're sort of high energy music with a lot going on.
Yeah, totally.
Which sort of leads us.
If you look at Billy's technique, his technique was much more metal influenced early on. You can kind of see in his right hand, and as time has gone on, I think he plays more and more like a bluegrass player. In that, one of the big things I think is that Billy's way more relaxed now. If you watch the older footage, it almost seems like he's fighting the guitar a little bit. And now he seems like he's really coming to his element, and it's easy, right? He doesn't have to fight the instrument. It just comes out. I think that's really cool.
It'd be really interesting to see, because I think I read something the other day that he's going to be doing a much more straight ahead bluegrass album with Terry Barber, with his dad, much more traditional sort of fiddle tune type stuff. I've seen some videos and playing live together, but I believe that's in the offing, and it'll be really interesting to hear him in a different context.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen those videos of him playing with his dad too. It's cool stuff. I like how they sing harmony together too. Yeah,
and there's a really cool video of Billy and Bryan Sutton at the Station Inn playing together, and just hearing him in a simpler context, just playing very traditional straight ahead stuff, is just fascinating, because he can do all of it. He's just choosing what he wants. Yeah,
it's true. He certainly in certain phrases that he plays, he navigates the fretboard, and kind of like you said, not because he can't do it another way, but he'll navigate the fretboard in simplistic ways because I think he likes the way it sounds. There's a lick that goes like this. I'll show you real quick. That goes like this. This is a Billy Strings lick. You hear it all the time. Whoops. Like that. And there's other ways to get up the fretboard, right? The line could have been more modern. Right? It could have been something like that, which feels like, to me, like a more modern player. That's what I would play. The Billy opts for kind of sliding the same shape, up the fretboard. It was kind of a Billy Strings thing to do, and I wouldn't do that, right? I wouldn't think of that. I would want to play. I try to put together this like individual line of like ba 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 ba. It wouldn't occur to me to just keep sliding that same shape.
And that's a much more rock and roll approach to playing lead guitar, isn't it? It's sort of taking those shapes and just sort of shifting them up and down a bit.
Yeah.
Cool. I mean, it sounds like a really strange segue to talk about heavy metal and link to bluegrass guitarists, but we just mentioned Trey Hensley, and we were sort of going from a very Doc Watson influenced player to a very Tony Rice influenced player, but also a player with just a wide open bag of influences from all over the shop.
Yeah, that's true.
I know you're a big fan of Trey.
Yeah, that's true. I've interviewed him a couple times on the channel. We need to do another one. But yeah, Trey is very influenced by the rock and roll thing, but he's also very influenced by the country thing. And like, for instance, of all the guitar players that we're going to talk about, the player who plays the most bends is Trey Hensley. But no way anyone even comes close to how much he bends on an acoustic, guitar, right? He's playing on like a, D-sized guitar with medium strings. He's bending a whole step. I mean, it's wild. No one else is doing that as much as Trey.
Well, I heard him talk about that on an interview a while ago, and he was sort of saying, those are slightly easier to do maybe on a slightly shorter scale Gibson guitar, but they're really hard work on a, dreadnought-sized Martin. And he said he works on it. It's something he gets the guitar out and makes sure that because it's really hard to do, but it's part of his style and something that he likes to do a lot.
Yeah. The one that always shocks me when I hear him do it is this country kind of bending lick. So if you're a guitar player, I'll explain it real quick. I'm on my B and my E string on 10th fret, and I'm only going to bend the B string up a whole step. So I'm going to play both strings, but only bend one. Right? It's tough to do with mediums, right?
Yeah.
On top of that, you can bend up and you can play other notes. Right, a line like that. And Trey does that kind of stuff all the time. And that's wild to me. I'm obviously not doing it as well as Trey. That's probably one of the hardest things to replicate, but it's very cool. I'll see him bend all the way down on, on like his D string or his A string, right? This kind of stuff. I can't even get it all the way too. Who's doing that on a steel string? It's remarkable.
And I think he's maybe spent more time than any of the guitarists we're talking about tonight playing electric guitar. I know he's done a lot of electric sessions in Nashville.
Country records and stuff too, yeah.
And I mean, not just guitar, he's singing. He's a very strong seam of country runs through what he does. There's an obvious Merle Haggard influence in the voice, and there's, an obvious Roy Nichols influence in the guitar as well. We are going to talk about Tony, but if we weren't talking about Tony, maybe I would say that Trey has the best voice on the list. I mean, it's a pretty good list for singers. There's some good voices on there. They've all got their own. You could do a whole podcast on them as singers. But he's got a great voice.
Yeah, he's got a remarkable voice. Great songwriter too. But his, if we're talking about Billy Strings and we're saying that like Billy Strings is bringing this like jam band influence to bluegrass, which he very much is. I think Trey Hensley is bringing this like country influence to bluegrass. Not just his guitar work, all the bends and stuff, but like you said, his voice, he doesn't have a traditional bluegrass voice. I mean, all these guys sing high. That's what I've tried my whole life to do. I normally sing tenor parts if I'm not singing lead. Trey can't do that. Trey has like a very baritone voice. So even some of these like classic bluegrass songs that are in like B flat and B and up there, Trey doesn't sing them up there. I won't say because he can't, but I suspect because he can't. He's just got a lower voice and he sounds great doing it.
Yeah, I mean, like you want to hear him sing where he sings. It sounds good.
Yeah, exactly. He is definitely one of my favorite players though. And I think one of the things that gets past a lot of people, and this isn't to talk trash on the recording industry or anything, but a lot of records just get really processed. So you take a lot of, like for instance, if you take your flat picking line, just naturally you tend to have these notes that are a little bit quieter, a little bit louder. You slap a compressor on that, you slap a limiter on that, you bury it in the mix, you slather the thing with reverb, and like suddenly your line sounds really good. It sounds like you played it just perfectly and all the notes are the right volume. And when you listen to Trey play, it just sounds like that. You can hear it in every interview and all of those like random live videos. You can hear that every single note coming out of his guitar is just clean and precise and perfect. And it must be some of that Tony Rice influence because Tony was very into, just the cleanliness of approach. But Trey's kind of taken it beyond that. Everything is just perfectly articulated and the volume is so consistent. Like sometimes when I'm talking to him and we're, in person, I'm listening to him play, it sounds like his guitar has a compressor on it. It sounds like it's already been limited and everything's been, sort of equalized. So all the notes are the same volume. He just plays like that. It's remarkable.
Yeah. And it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's when you talk about a guitarist's style, it's very easy to talk about note choices and right hand technique but tone and tone production is such a big thing, isn't it? And that's part of technique, and but just the sound people get out of an instrument is a very personal thing, particularly an acoustic instrument.
Oh yeah. And and if I've ever felt inadequate tone wise, it's when I'm talking to Trey. If you watch the interviews that I've done with him back, there's moments where he plays a lick and then I play it. You can hear when he plays it, everything has that perfectly even feel. And when I play it, like one note will be way louder, one note will be way quieter. And like, I need that help, right? Please compress the hell out of my guitar track so it sounds like Trey's. But he just sounds like that. Yeah, it's remarkable.
And it's interesting listening to some of the recordings. There's him and Rob Ikes and Tommy Emmanuel. And, obviously Tommy's got a very different technique and a very different tone. And it's really interesting listening to a recording when you know there are two guitarists and you can just tell who it is from the tone before you even listen to the notes. They sound like themselves.
And, Tommy is a great guitar player, but I'm kind of shocked when I watch the videos and I see Tommy keeping up with Trey so well. Because let's say it this way, Tommy does like a lot of stuff, right? He plays guitar in a lot of different ways. He does the fingerstyle thing, he flat picks, and he, does this and that, and he's very good at all of it. Trey kind of only does the flat picking. And so the fact that Tommy can keep up with Trey at Trey's like only thing, right? The thing he really does is remarkable. Hats off to Tommy.
And he sort of like feels like Trey has something in common maybe with Cody Kilby and maybe somebody like Jake Eddy's coming through now. There's a certain speed and cleanliness. I think what you said before was a great. You said, I think you would use the word articulated, and there's that quality about it, isn't there? It's not, you don't.
Yeah, there is.
It feels just solid, and it doesn't feel like he's fighting to get it out. It feels like it's, I
think the interesting thing about Trey is that he doesn't lose, with that, amazing amount of precision and like tone production he has, he doesn't really lose, kind of like that vibe or that feel or anything. It still feels very like human. I think some of those other players that we're talking about, like Cody Kilby, Jake Workman, that kind of player of like just hotshot bluegrass player that plays with, an A-list national band. Mm-hmm. A lot of times they almost feel like machines, which is very cool. I'm not knocking that. I mean, that's remarkable in its own right, but it almost feels like it's programmed or something. They like go through it so fast and so clean. Everything's just so. And even though Trey plays that cleanly, he doesn't feel like a robot to me,
Yeah, it's a really interesting, just a really interesting mix. He feels like like all of us are as musicians, but just taking a whole load of stuff and put it together to sound like himself. Yeah,
he really has. Taking this back to one of the other passages I showed earlier, I pointed out that Billy Strings would go up the neck with like this repeated shape, right? And I said like the modern bluegrass player would play this line, right? Something like that. A lot of times Trey Hensley will subvert that too, right? Let's do a third option, the Trey Hensley option. A lot of times Trey will do that, using these kind of diagonal pentatonic boxes, which is a very like country guitar player thing to do. Right? Just so we don't get demonetized, I won't say it, but there's a popular country song that starts like that. Right, that's a great example of that technique. Right, that's the kind of thing that Trey will do, which is right like a third option.
And it's almost
it's very cool.
And it's almost like position shifting on a mandolin, in that you're going between, you're using slides and fingering to get between different positions, rather than playing lines that move through those positions or just sliding shapes up and down. It's, there's definite pockets within the neck that you're moving between.
Yeah, if you're imagining, if you are a mandolin player or if you have some understanding of mandolin, you have these pentatonic scales that have like 3 notes on a string, then 2 notes on a string, then 3 notes on a string, then 2 notes on a string. And in the case of the mandolin, it kind of leads you diagonally, kind of in the wrong direction. As in, when you get higher up the neck, you end up on a lower string. On the guitar, since it's upside down, as you go higher up the neck, you end up on a higher string, right? It's sort of all in line with how you'd expect it to go. So, that's why country guitar players do that. It takes advantage of that principle. Yet another country guitar thing that Trey does is the country sixth interval, which you've heard from like this lick. Which is like the beginning of Lovesick Blues, Hank Williams.
Yeah.
But Trey will do those too. So you can imagine Trey coming out of like a 5 chord and playing 6. getting to the one chord and playing bends. And maybe he wants to continue and he uses a diagonal pentatonic. That's like all very Trey Hensley stuff to do. And that's, kind of like the Billy Strings example. These aren't specific songs or anything. I'm just taking in what I know and trying to replicate kind of choices they make.
It's very cool. And there is obviously that, there is that Tony Rice influence. I remember another interview that I remember Trey talking about Tony and saying somebody had given him a cassette that had Manzanita on it, and from the first few notes he was just sort of hooked. And he said, I think he said the actual line, "I have to limit my Tony Rice intake." Instead of I'm on stage and can't hear myself if a song kicks off too quick, I just go into Tony Rice mode. It's like a nervous tick or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he was talking about in an interview with me. He was talking about how he gets stressed out when they're playing Tony Rice as like the pre-show music at his shows. And he's like, he can't listen to it because if he listens to it, he'll end up playing like Tony Rice. He's very good at replicating Tony Rice's style too. There's sort of classic Tony licks that I guess we'll get to later, but Trey does them very, very easily, very well. Also, here's an interesting fact about Trey and how his brain works. Trey doesn't read tab. Trey doesn't read sheet music. He sort of doesn't do that. And if he does it at all, he does it very slowly, from what he's told me. And but that doesn't stop him from having this like encyclopedic knowledge of all these breaks. So I've heard him talk about certain cuts off like Bluegrass Album Band or Tony Rice Plays and Sings. And Trey will not only play Tony's break and be like, "Oh, this is what Tony played," and just nail it. But then he'll also be like, yeah, and then the mandolin break goes, and the mandolin break goes like this, and he'll play the mandolin break on guitar, right? So he, I don't know how he does it, but he's just osmosised up all of this sort of material, and he can just like replicate multiple people's break off of the same cut. It's very impressive.
It's incredible, isn't it? And I think that's the thing is, it took me a while to get my head around that if you're going to go, you could say, looking for influences, or you could call it shoplifting from people's records. Like, don't just shoplift from the guitar parts. There's, some of my favorite breaks on bluegrass songs are like, there's an amazing Jason Carter fiddle break on one of the tunes on Steve Earle's bluegrass album. There's some great mandolin breaks on some of the Tony Rice stuff. There's, and Trey talks about, going off and listening to jazz guitarists or saxophonists, or, I get the sense that he's always looking for a new inspiring thing. He's not content just to sit back and listen to what he listens to. He's always looking for a new sound, a new thing.
Yeah, right. Trey really does listen to everything. And a good example of that is the, what's that thing, the sequestered songwriters thing? Trey used to do all these live streams on Facebook during the height of the pandemic. And he would do these like kind of dedicated sets to different singers, and it was kind of all over the map, right? It would be like singer-songwriters or like country artists or bluegrass artists, and he would just put together and perform, just live on Facebook, an entire hour or more of material just from one artist. Wow. And once again, his brain works in a very interesting way. I don't know how he remembers all that material or how he has arrangements of all that cooked up. But I get the feeling that if you just ran into Trey and you were like, "Hey, can you play obscure cut from Merle Haggard?" I bet he could. Just shocking.
It's one of the things that, and again, we'll probably talk about this later when we talk about Tony, but he's pointed out particularly how much Tony's rhythm playing is important to him. And it's something, when I interviewed Chris Eldridge a while ago, he said, like, I love Tony's lead playing, but I would take the rhythm playing if I had to choose. And and we'll no doubt come on to them when we talk about Tony, but he's maybe one of those players that people do talk about the rhythm playing as much as the lead playing, which is not traditionally the way it goes.
No, they really do. Trey's rhythm playing I think is really interesting because he's always playing in the duo with Rob Ickes, right? And that means that at least in their live performances on the album, they have a bunch of other instruments, but in the live performances, his rhythm playing is really exposed, and you can actually soak it all up. When you listen to like Tony's rhythm playing, except for like Skaggs and Rice and Church Street Blues. I mean, it's hard to get the rhythm playing because, there's a banjo player in the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Apart from my manzanita.
Yeah, I think Trey is a little bit of a rhythm chameleon, and that's a big compliment, right? I think he really plays the rhythm style that suits the song, and he kind of nails it. When he's doing Tony material, he plays rhythm like Tony. When he's doing country material, he's probably imitating some country rhythm player that I don't know the name of.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I just sort of got so much out of just preparing for this chat that we're having because of the players that we're talking about. Trey's the one that I knew least, and it's just got me diving in a bit more, and I've just enjoyed it and just want to sort of dive in deeper and learn more now. He's a fascinating player and seems to be a fascinating character as well.
Yeah, if you haven't heard Trey at all, I think one of the funniest introductions to Trey is to go watch him play Freeborn Man on this like morning country show. And the video has a really clickbait title. It's like amazingly fast bluegrass pickers or something, all caps. But he's playing Freeborn Man for, it's two names. It's someone and something in the morning. It's like a Nashville station. I can't think of it. But he goes out and he just crushes it. It's like 8 a.m. and I asked him about that performance, and I think he's a little embarrassed by it. I think he thinks he could have done better. But it is such a great introduction. It's just like someone's, camera phone of him in the radio station, and he's just killing it. It's just so good. And maybe it's not everyone's cup of tea. It's a very aggressive kind of sound, but it's very cool.
It's always exciting to hear that done.
Yeah.
So next person we've got on the list is somebody else who sort of like Billy Strings is everywhere right now and is sort of bringing people in and crossing over between bluegrass and non-bluegrass audiences, and that's Molly Tuttle. And, she's sort of fascinating in so many ways. There's the obvious sort of claw hammer guitar thing to talk about, but she's, again, also very clean, articulate player, and has what probably most guitar teachers would point to as a relatively unorthodox right-hand technique in terms of how her arm's placed and where her wrist is, and totally. But it doesn't seem to hold her back in the slightest.
To talk about Molly, this isn't to toot my own horn. I think most people would look at my YouTube channel and be like, okay, Marcel can play a guitar. But on my YouTube channel, there's lots of videos of me playing note for note along with Billy Strings. There's lots of videos of me going note for note with Trey Hensley, going note for note with Tony Rice, and like maybe not 100%, but let's say, at least 95% nailing what they did. And there are very few videos of me nailing what Molly Tuttle does. She terrifies me. It's very difficult to replicate what Molly Tuttle does. And I think if you go back and you look at the videos of me trying to play along to Molly Tuttle, you'll see that I haven't done a particularly great job.
And what is it makes that so hard? Is it the right hand?
I think it is. She has a, to talk about why her right hand's unique before we get into the tough stuff. She has a habit of kind of anchoring sort of like right below your thumb, kind of in the meat of your palm right there. She'll anchor right there on the bridge pins when she plays. And there's a video that Troy Grady has done where he's got the camera looking down the fretboard. And you can see she plays very open when she's playing rhythm. And then when she goes to play lead, she kind of clamps down. And the reason we don't normally teach that is because any kink in your arm is potentially where you might, damage your tendons or something. People get tendonitis and stuff from that. Repetitive motion injuries when their arms aren't straight. Just like typing on your keyboard, right? And so normally we don't teach people to push in there because there's the potential for your wrist to collapse. And, you literally have a tunnel in there. You're bending the tunnel, carpal tunnel. And when Molly does that, though, it doesn't seem like her wrist is really collapsing. So I don't want to misrepresent her technique, but she does push her hand down on those bridge pins. She just doesn't curve it in. I'm showing you as we do this talk, but I know that people won't be able to see this.
But if you go and watch videos of Molly playing, it's pretty obvious what Marcel's talking about, I think. But there's also the sort of the forearm placement. It's most players tend to rest the upper arm on the top of the guitar, leaving the arm to sort of swing free. And Molly sort of rests the top bit of her forearm on the guitar almost. It's a very the whole thing looks very constricted, and yet she has utter freedom to do whatever it is she wants to do.
You know, some of that, just from having taught lots of people, some of that is just, you know, bodies being built differently. You know, like a D28 is always the same size, and everyone's forearms are a slightly different length. So you see people sort of have to, you know, cradle up to the guitar in different ways to get their arm kind of in that right position. And I guess I've never met Molly in person, so I don't know. But in the footage that I've seen, it kind of seems like, you know, just the shape and size of your body and like how your limbs are proportioned kind of affects how that happens. And it seems like that's what's going on to me rather than like a quirk of technique. I think she's just, you know, not built like any of these other players.
Yeah, and I think it's just, I think the cool thing about all of it is that there is sort of quote unquote correct form for everything. But there are players through the years who do extraordinary things and are utterly themselves without needing to conform to all of that. And it's, you know, they're sort of guidelines and averages. They're not necessarily hard, fast rules.
That's such a nice way to look at it. Yeah. You're, the only danger you run is that you like a guitar player so much that you start practicing their quirks. And you shouldn't practice people's quirks. You should look at the averages, like you said. You should try to shoot for this idealized technique. And if you have something that doesn't work out perfectly, that's fine. That's your quirk, right? And so, you know, like if we go through some of these other players we talked about, Billy Strings, in his early years when he was playing, he'd flex every muscle in his entire body. I would consider that a quirk, right? Don't copy that. It's probably not healthy. He doesn't do it anymore, which is probably best for his body. Or someone like Tony's kind of got this weird thumb thing where like as he's picking, he rocks his thumb back and forth. That doesn't make you play like Tony. Don't copy that. And similarly for Molly, right? This like super hard plant on the bridge pins, which actually I kind of do, if I'm being honest, is probably not the thing to copy either. The quirk of my own that people always point out is that sometimes when I should use my ring finger, I use my pinky instead in my left hand fretting work. And people are always like, "Oh, why'd you use that finger?" And I don't even notice.
Well, that's the thing. It's,
don't copy the quirks.
I think once you get to a certain point of having played for an amount of time, it can be quite hard to explain to people how you do what you do. I interviewed Happy Tram from Homespun fairly recently. He was talking about working with Tony Rice and saying that, you know, he ended up sitting in and sort of interviewing him because Tony couldn't necessarily explain how he was doing what he was doing. You know, he'd say, "I'll try and slow it down and show you as much as I can to the best of my ability, but it's just sort of how I did it." And
there's a great moment in one of those, I think it's Happy that's interviewing Tony, and Tony plays an interesting chord shape, and Happy says like, "Oh, isn't that like an A9?" And Tony says, "Well, it's an A7 chord." And if you know anything about theory, you know that A9 and A7 are very closely related, right? An A9 chord does the same thing as an A7 chord. It's just got one extra note in it. And but that doesn't like click with Tony, right? He's just like, "No, in my brain this is A7." And you can see that it's kind of like a struggle in the interview where like Happy wants to convey all the information to the watcher, like, "Oh, it's an A9 chord." And Tony's like, "No, it's not. It's an A7," which isn't technically correct. but what are you going to do? Are you going to say no to Tony Rice? No, you let it slide.
The interesting information in all of those kind of conversations is not necessarily what it is or what it isn't, but how he approaches it. And it's like, that's the insight, isn't it? Is what he's thinking when he's doing it is.
Yeah,
that,
right.
You know,
his
that
brain,
this is how he's using it. And it's exactly. And he used to argue with Tony Rice's brain. But
anyway,
so, yeah.
Back to Molly.
Yeah. And so sort of that sort of aside, one of the most striking things I think that people hear first in maybe not so much now because Molly's got this sort of more straight bluegrass album, Crooked Tree, which is glorious. But still on that, there's sort of the claw hammer technique on guitar, which is not something she invented. It's something, you know, she came across and decided to learn, but it's a very distinctive sound and very much part of what she's become known for.
Yeah, it's a remarkable technique. I wish I could replicate it for the listeners at home, but I cannot. And I've tried. It's like an old time banjo technique, right? This claw hammer thing. And there's lots of different kind of little segments of this technique. And Molly must have learned this at some point, as a child, and just converted it to guitar, because there's videos of her very young doing this claw hammer guitar thing. It's not something she came across as an adult. This is a sort of a combination, like technique for another instrument on guitar that she figured out when she was quite young.
And it's sort of a slightly altered tuning she used as well. It's essentially an open G tuning, but with the B string tuned up to a C. So there's no open thirds in the tuning at all. So it's got that sort of slightly I think she describes it as...
that modal kind of sound, yeah.
I think she describes it as mountain minor tuning at one point. It's that just, it takes out... It leaves that ambiguity in there. But yeah, go and Google Molly Tuttle clawhammer and see what it is we're talking about. Because the only time I've seen Molly was over here in the UK as part of the Transatlantic Sessions tour a few years ago.
Oh, right.
And the first song she did was Take the Journey, and I'd never seen anybody play guitar like that in my life, sort of slightly gobsmacked by the clarity and the drive of it, and just the sort of, the amount of poke in it, really. It's like a very driving, hard sound. It's
a remarkable sound. And if you're going down that rabbit hole, I highly suggest you watch the music video for Take the Journey, because it's this very weird, like, truck commercial. I don't know how to explain it. The music video is for sure sponsored by, like, Chevy or something. And it's Molly Tuttle just, like, banging out this remarkable song, and then, like, trucks cruising through the desert. I love you, Molly. I hope you made a lot of money on that one.
So aside from some of the technical stuff, what is it about, like when you transcribe Molly's playing, what is it you hear in there, and what is it you find in there that you don't find anywhere else?
Yeah, what she's better at than a lot of modern players, or like, her like particular strength and superpower on the guitar, is how strong her alternate picking is. And so if you hold a pick in your hand and you imagine the motion, if you're doing like true, honest alternate picking, as you play a downstroke, your pick should point towards the floor. And as you play an upstroke, your pick points towards the ceiling. Not that dramatically, right? As you play faster, that little arc gets tighter and tighter. So maybe it's, only 20 degrees or something, right? It's not as dramatic. Maybe not even that. And if you watch Molly do that, specifically when she's like cross-picking, when she's going past different strings, you can imagine that as you play downstroke, your pick has to clear the strings so you can hit the upstroke on the next lower string. So if it was like E string and B string, right, our two highest strings, downstroke on the E string, pick points towards the floor so I can clear the E string to hit upstroke on the B string, right? It's this kind of like dangerous motion so you can not get caught up on anything. And if you try to play that with your sloppy technique like me, it's a mess. You end up hitting all these extra strings because you don't have enough clearance. You haven't like rotated for the alternate picking enough. And Molly nails it all the time, which means, like David Greer, for instance, is she can play these big string skips and just have this laser accuracy. She's got her guitar in drop D. She hits the low D and then comes up and just like snipes the B string with an upstroke, right? It's like, how did you just catch that so cleanly? I try to do that and I'm like accidentally grabbing my E string, accidentally grabbing the G string. She's just got like perfect accuracy. And so a lot of these breaks that you look at, especially her arrangements of fiddle tunes, these obscure fiddle tunes, she does like an obscure Norwegian one, that I won't even try to pronounce, but maybe if you type in Molly Tuttle Norwegian fiddle tune, you'll find it. She's got all these moments where she's skipping strings, she's jumping around. She kind of plays it in a way that no one else can do it. It's remarkable. And I've transcribed a lot of them. I can look at what she's doing and write it down on paper, but then I go to play it and I realize that this is a pipe dream. It's so difficult.
Does that make it hard to transcribe them because there are sort of some jumps and movements going on that you just wouldn't expect?
Sometimes, but it's you can write down stuff that you can't play. I've transcribed like banjo breaks, and I've transcribed like jazz saxophone players and stuff before, and I can't play those instruments, but I can write down what they're doing. I guess there is a little bit of like a topographical thing of the fretboard where like I hear a note and I would expect it to be in a certain place, but maybe she's grabbed it somewhere else. Sometimes that happens, but that's not the difficult part. The difficult part is having to play it yourself after the transcription's done.
It's really cool. Like obviously Molly's got this new record, which is much more bluegrass than the previous ones. And it's just, it's glorious hearing her in that context. But it's one of the sort of interesting things of the modern world, really, is like, so Trey Hensley, for example, if you go and listen to his recorded catalogue, there's not that much straight bluegrass in there. There's a lot more country, blues, sort of. Yeah. But we have the joy of being able to go online and see all these players playing lots of fiddle tunes and things they haven't recorded or, sort of officially put out. There's just so much material out there now, and you get to see people play in all these different contexts. And it's really cool. And just hearing Molly sort of recently just doing stuff with a straight ahead bluegrass band is such a glorious sound.
I think that was a kind of, you said Billy Strings was divisive. I think that this is a divisive move. Let me say it this way. If Billy Strings is bringing this jam band thing, Trey Hensley is bringing this kind of like country influence. I think Molly Tuttle was bringing in kind of a pop influence, which I thought was very interesting on her records before Crooked Tree. Do I love hearing her play bluegrass? Yeah, I love hearing her play bluegrass. Do I always want to hear her play bluegrass? I mean, yeah, probably. But it's really cool to have an artist like breaking into like newer territory. And she was certainly doing that kind of on her last record and the record of covers too. It had some distorted guitar and stuff on it. Yeah. Those are experimental records. And I think that experimentation should kind of be praised,
Yeah, totally. And I think there's some really cool artists around who we like to think of as bluegrass artists and can totally do that, but don't always do it. So, for example, and Sarah Jarosz, for example, can play bluegrass mandolin with the best of them. And yet, if you listen to her records, they're not really bluegrass records. Or Sierra Hull's recent records, the last couple of albums are not blue. They're just songs arranged the way she hears them. And I think that's brilliant. And Nickel Creek, for all the success, were never really at any point a straight ahead bluegrass band. They very much straddled that line between acoustic music, pop. It does what it does.
I struggle with that because I love traditional bluegrass, but you ask yourself that question sometimes, like, do we need another recording of Red Haired Boy? Probably not. Are we going to play it at the jam? Maybe, but like, do we need to sit down and like cut that one? I don't think so. So, every once in a while, someone really nails it on a record. Bluegrass Album Band is a great example, right? Where Tony Rice, cuts a bunch of classic bluegrass tunes, or like the Chris Thile and Michael Dave's record, Sleep with One Eye Open. Yeah. And they cut a bunch of traditional material and they just crushed it. And it's kind of like a statement, like, hey, we normally do slightly weirder stuff, but like, here's us doing the trad stuff. I think that's what Molly has done here. I think she's going to go back to doing kind of the pop influence stuff. She's just like, hey, by the way, I can still do bluegrass. Right? Yeah,
totally. And it's that thing of maybe Bryan Sutton's Not Too Far From the Tree record is a good example of that as well, of just straight ahead fiddle tune playing on guitars that's a record totally we needed to hear, And I think we do like to sort of shackle people to things sometimes. The amount of people who say Punch Brothers are great, I wish they'd play more bluegrass, or the amount of people who would, want Molly Tuttle to play more bluegrass, or the amount of people who, this exists in the jazz world as well. There's lots of people who appreciate modern players but just want them to play 1950s jazz. And,
we really need another recording of Scrapple from the Apple. We really need another recording of Donna Lee. I don't think so.
And that's all there, and there's some great stuff, and you can go back and listen to it whenever you want. Yeah, and it is, particularly with something like bluegrass, a couple of the artists we're talking about today, probably Trey Hensley, not really a bluegrass artist. He's a very good bluegrass guitar player, but he's also much more, as is Molly Tuttle. And I mean, Tony Rice made whole albums of music that you couldn't even vaguely describe as bluegrass.
Yeah. Personal anecdotal evidence here, but I put out my record recently, which is very like Newgrass Revival inspired. I guess we put it out last year, but it's got a lot of, kind of 80s drum sounds on it, and nothing's arranged really as a bluegrass song, but it's all bluegrass instruments. And, let me tell you, those were the comments that I got immediately, were like, hey, the album's good, but you need to ditch those drums. I got comments like that. And I thought that was funny, cause everyone's kind of looking for the next new thing. And like, what did you want? Did you want me to record the album with Red Haired Boy on it? I don't think you would have been satisfied with that either.
Yeah.
So I think we end up with a lot of bluegrass artists that are kind of in that, in between the rock and the hard place, right? Do I release the progressive album that I want to do, or do I do the traditional album? Because both of them are going to receive some amount of, hate from the audience, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of Molly, we talked a little bit about Billy and Trey and sort of note choices and sort of style of the kind of licks they use. And is there any sort of particular signature Molly things that make Molly sound hers?
Yeah, this is great. I gave examples of the other players, and it's like, give a Molly example. Like, I haven't played my guitar once. Yeah, one really great thing about Molly's playing is how well she cross-picks and how fast she can cross-pick. Not that it's about speed or anything, but one of the limitations of cross-picking is that you normally can't do it very quickly. It's kind of a speed-restricted item to add to your breaks. Things get too fast and you can't really cross-pick anymore. And Molly Tuttle seems to have no such limitation, which I find really remarkable. But the patterns aren't super interesting to bring up because they're kind of classic cross-picking patterns, right? It's like that kind of stuff. But, Molly's doing it at, 5,000 BPMs. So if there was anything that, that I could steal from Molly as a player, right? If I could Space Jam, you touch the basketball and you get all the skills of the famous player. If I could do that with Molly Tuttle, it would probably be the cross picking that I'd really want to steal. She's just remarkable at it. And also, to talk about cross picking, it's kind of a dated art form. There was a long time when it wasn't looked at so favorably. Like if you look at, 80s bluegrass, there's not a lot of cross picking happening because they were looking at it as like, oh, that's the old school. We don't want to do that. I guess except for like Tony Rice's Church Street Blues, but that's kind of like anti-cross picking in a way. Like there is no straight pattern. It's like constantly moving around and shifting. He doesn't play a strict pattern. And Molly's in a way kind of bringing that back. Billy does it too, to an extent, but Molly does it more traditionally, where it is a straight pattern that she's nailing. She did an interview with Acoustic Guitar Magazine where she wrote an arrangement of Wildwood Flower that was cross-picking. And it's a beautiful, very clever, smart arrangement that uses like forward rolls, backwards rolls. There's a square roll in there. It's got some string skipping. It's remarkably clever and very traditional at the same time. And she probably deserves more credit for that. She does it better than anyone else.
And this cool thing is, we're talking about Molly and Billy as being progressive and sort of moving between genres. And yeah, they're both of them use cross-picking a lot. It's something and it may well be that in 5-10 years, everybody cross-picks because Billy Strings and Molly Tuttle cross-pick.
It's come back.
It may be one of those things again. Which sort of brings us...
Time to start practicing cross-picking then. Get in early.
It's definitely something that I've neglected. I think of all the sort of disciplines in flat picking that I've spent quite a lot of time looking at rhythm. I've spent a lot of time working on sort of tone and a lot of time thinking about note choices and understanding the fretboard. But I've never really spent much time on cross picking. But one thing I love is that example you gave of Tony Rice Church Street Blues, and also on the same record there's things like One More Night, and where it's almost it's sort of half cross picking, half rhythm playing. It's just it's sort of bringing out a melody and something and adding some texture to it. And it's sort of unique the way he does it, which leads us sort of nicely onto Tony, I think, because it feels at the moment, and maybe this is partly because we lost him so recently, and there's been such an outpouring of just affection and attention for Tony for the last couple of years. But it feels at the moment that all bluegrass guitar conversations lead back to Tony Rice in some form.
Yeah,
but maybe that will always be the way it is. Maybe that's all. Maybe that's been the way it was for a long time, and I'm just not as deeply into the bluegrass guitar thing for as long as a lot of people. But it's such
I've started referring to it as like the pre-Tony Rice period and the post-Tony Rice period because it feels so distinct. Suddenly everyone wants to play like Tony. It's weird.
And there's definite sense of that. And one of the things that Tony sort of brought to flat picking and to bluegrass was that sort of, this sort of lick-based improvisational approach rather than a melodic approach necessarily, and a lot of flat thirds, a lot of flat sevenths, a lot of, sort of an approach maybe slightly more based on a vocabulary of licks and how he used them.
Yeah,
and you might get with certain other players.
Yeah, I think that, Tony's at the forefront of something, right? Something very interesting when he's releasing his first albums. And when you think about all of the bluegrass instruments, they all have something that they're kind of well suited for. The banjo is well suited for like arpeggios, right? And that's why we have like 3-finger rolls, and like a lot of it's chord based up to a point, right? And then, for the mandolin, right? The mandolin does like tremolo. We have our strings and choruses, there's sort of a mandolin sound we expect. Mandolins are also great for playing fiddle tunes. Really easy to get a melody out on a mandolin, just like on a fiddle. Fiddle also can be microtonal, right? So things can be slightly out of tune in a way that feels good. They can also play notes for an indefinite amount of time. The only instrument that can do that, right? A fiddle can play a note that lasts forever just by recycling their bow motion. So there's lots of interesting things that different instruments have to their benefit, and the guitar didn't really have that. The guitar doesn't have a distinct voice until we get players like Clarence White and Tony Rice. And what the what the big innovation was, not really an innovation, but is basically blues and chromaticism. And the reason that's so remarkable from all those players is that no other instrument is suited well to do it. So on the mandolin, the fingering works out in such a way that it's difficult to play chromatic things, right? Your first finger is covering 2 frets, your second finger is covering 2 frets, your third finger is covering 2 frets. If you have to play a chromatic scale, a lot of these fingers are doing double duty. It makes it kind of difficult. On the fiddle, you have no frets, right? So it's hard to get chromatic things in tune. On the banjo, once again, it's all chord-based, so we're certainly not playing chromatic things up to a point, right? Banjo does have a breakthrough later on, but in this time period, really guitar is the only instrument that can do it. So when you think about that aggressive, chromatic, bluesy, Tony Rice sound, it's kind of breaking into this forefront of like, this is like the thing that only guitar can do. And suddenly it feels like guitar has a superpower along with the rest of them, right?
Yeah.
So you can imagine a lot of these licks you associate with Tony Rice, this kind of like, that kind of sound, has a lot of chromatic moments in it. D, C sharp, D. And if you had to play those 3 notes in a row, like on a fiddle or a mandolin or a banjo, they might struggle to make that as clean as Tony Rice can with a flat pick. And so it's kind of like everyone's fighting different battles, and Tony found the like one that he can win at.
Yeah, it's really interesting because people talk about Tony and his sort of incredible style and personality and the way he played, and we've all, I'm sure, heard the stories of him saying basically I ended up playing the way I played because I tried to play like Clarence and couldn't. And just finding it's that thing, isn't it, of like going back to talking about artists who are or aren't bluegrass or where people fit. You and talk about Trey Hensley, you take on a bunch of stuff and you find the thing that's your thing amongst all of it.
Yeah.
And he found a thing that was very much his thing.
Yeah, the progression from Clarence to Tony which is I think kind of a soft spot. People are real sore about that. You have real Clarence White fans that are like, no, Clarence invented all of it. He deserves more recognition. And then you have Tony Rice fans that are like, no, Tony Rice expanded on it in such a way that he is the hero. And it'll probably be a never-ending argument. I don't really want to take stake in that. But what I will say is that there a lot of the language is similar. So undeniably, Tony Rice borrowed a lot of Clarence's language to get started, which is fine. It's good. It's what everyone does. But I think Tony's execution is really what sets it apart. And so Clarence has a way of like playing with time. Clarence will play things way behind the beat or way ahead of the beat, in such a way that feels very dramatic and bluesy. It feels like an electric guitar player, which we know Clarence was as well, right? Tony has a way of dictating the beat much clearer. So even when he is playing with time, he's playing syncopated things. You know, a bunch of statements start on the and as opposed to on the beat. It's still very much in time. And though he may push and drag here and there, it's not as dramatic as Clarence. And similarly, kind of like I talked about that tonal production of certain notes being louder or quieter, that can be a really interesting technique to use in, especially in like early bluegrass or pre-bluegrass. You hear guitar players do that. And Tony kind of tones that down, right? Tony, though he does have notes that like pop out of the mix and like, whoa, right? What happened there? There is like a general consistency, much more than any guitar player before him. Sort of, you know, towards that Trey Hensley or Jake Workman or Cody Gilby end of the spectrum, right? Where they have this really clear dictated tone. Tony's kind of moving in that direction, right? He's kind of inventing that. So while Clarence is a huge influence, there's like really characteristic differences in like time and tone between Clarence and Tony that's just undeniable. You can hear it in the recordings. And so in a way, it's almost like what I just explained, this like bluesy no choice thing. Maybe that wasn't the thing that really did it, you know, because there was a player doing it before Tony. Maybe the thing that really did it was just Tony doing it cleaner. Or not cleaner, but in a way that suited the rest of bluegrass, you know, a little better.
Yeah, and as you throw out music, there's sort of examples of people who haven't necessarily invented anything, but have just taken stuff to the next level. Like Mozart didn't invent any of the forms he composed in, but he excelled at he took them all forward. Exactly. The Beatles put together country and rock and roll and rhythm and blues and stuff that they learned to play cabaret, and added in their own thing and took it somewhere entirely different. But they didn't start off with anything particularly new. They just took a bunch of existing forms and did them in a way nobody else had done them.
And we can say that about a lot of influential early bluegrass musicians, right? We know that Earl Scruggs is like the king of three-finger banjo, but he isn't the first person to play three-finger. There's like, what's his name? Scruffy Jenkins? Something like that. I don't remember his name. There's a player before Earl Scruggs that did kind of a similar style. And I'm not saying that, you know, Earl Scruggs, you know, suddenly isn't one of the fathers of bluegrass because of that. No, it's just how it works, right? You like hear someone else doing it and you're like, great, I can do that better. Watch me. You know, and you try to prove to the world that you're better at this thing, whether you are or aren't. And I think that's what the situation Tony was in, right? He loves Clarence. He loves his playing. He's going to like get what he can out of it. And then he's going to be like, all right, but I'm Tony. How can I be the best Tony?
Yeah. And also like sort of thinking about what we were talking about with Trey earlier, a really wide range of, you know, it certainly feels when you read and listen to things about Tony that he spent most of his time listening to jazz, not listening to bluegrass, certainly in his later years anyway. That, you know, the influences came from all over the place.
Yeah, Tony, if you listen to his song selection too, you know, Tony didn't write a lot of vocal tunes. I think the only one that I know off the top of my head for sure is Never Meant to Be, which he wrote about his divorce. It's on the singer-songwriter collection. That's kind of the big Tony Rice vocal tune that he actually wrote. All the others are covers, and the covers are from a big range of sources. A lot of them are like just singer-songwriters, like Gordon Lightfoot or James Taylor or Jim Croce. Some of them were like rock and roll tunes, right? Some of them, right. Some of the instrumentals were jazz tunes. He does My Favorite Things. And, you know, there's lots of, maybe the biggest compliment about Tony's records is that he's really good at choosing songs for himself. If you're going to put together a record that's all you covering other people's material, man, Tony Rice did that better than anyone. He picks good songs and songs that like suit him that he's just going to crush.
I mean, to the point that people forget, I think sometimes, how many of them are covers because they just feel like he owns them.
Yeah, I had a student talking to me about Old Train, right? This Tony Rice kid. And he was like, yeah, if you play that at a jam, you have to do the Tony Rice kick. That may be true, but I was like, hey, it's a seldom seen tune. Like, it doesn't have to be. It wasn't a guitar kick there. Like, someone else can kick that song off. You don't have to play the Tony lick. But no one does that, right? Everyone plays it like Tony. It's become Tony's tune. It's weird.
Yeah, it's sort of same with Church Street Blues, and despite the fact that we all know and love the Norman Blake version, and for a lot of people, Norman's is their favourite version, and but just becomes such an iconic thing. And I remember I interviewed Bob Minner about his Norman Blake tribute record, and he got Vince Gill to come in and sing Church Street Blues on that record, and it's sort of quite nice hearing it treated just as a song, because you get so used to hearing it as a sort of iconic piece of guitar playing, which it is. But there's sort of no point note for note trying to do that, because you're not going to do any better than that. So it's just nice. It was really refreshing just to hear it treated as a song and just be sung, because it's a great song.
I tell everyone too that if you're going to work on Tony Rice's break, you're going to be working on it for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
People ask when the Church Street Blues video is coming out, and I'm still working on it, right? But that kind of coming back to our cross-picking conversation, I said that Church Street Blues was almost like anti-cross-picking. It's because normally these patterns come in like square chunks, right? Like we talked about the Billy Strings lick. And you can hear 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You can hear like the sort of like the banjo 3-finger roll, right? If you listen to Church Street Blues, it has no 3-finger like repeated moment. There are moments. 1, 2, 3. There's one. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So there's little segments that feel like 3-finger rolls, but the tune itself is not like built on that principle solely. It's got a lot of other like little lines that keep peeking out. It's like a tapestry of ideas. And that's, I think, why it's so charming. You listen to Tony Rice's version, you're like, whoa. I think people are so enchanted by the tune that they don't even realize how difficult it is. They're just like, wow, that's beautiful. How do I play that? And then they look at it and they're like, oh, I don't.
Yeah.
I should just listen to it.
It just sounds so, and I think you're right, because like you saw that word tapestry used, and because he's not picking patterns and sticking with them because it's a sort of choice. Each time he puts a pattern in there, it's because it's right for the rhythm that he's trying to create, and he wants this flow, and he wants to just nudge the beat here, or just take something across the bar line, or whatever he's doing. And because of that, they feel like he couldn't possibly have made any other choices than those. They feel so right, and it feels so natural. And so it is deceptive. And you listen to it and think, oh, that's pretty simple, pretty little bit guitar playing.
No.
And then you look at what he's at, and then you think about like pick direction and all of that as well, because there's some alternate picking. There's some, some sort of swept. And in the same way that as a rhythm player, Tony would do that classic sort of bluegrass rhythm thing, and he would just put in all downs in a row, all downstrokes, in a way that and it's hard to do, but it sounds great.
Yeah, it's very hard to do. I normally cheat it. I normally alternate pick it, which isn't the same sort of like feel at all. You can kind of hear the alternate picking, but I find that like 4 downstrokes in a row really hard to get in time.
Yeah, the glorious thing about alternate picking is exactly where you are at any given time, because you've got this unbreakable sort of backwards, forwards, back pendulum sort of thing going on, and whatever beat it is you want to play, how you're supposed to play it. Whereas when you get into that stuff, it's it's getting the rhythm back is really hard. Yeah.
Tony has a really interesting way of breaking the pick strokes. Church Street Blues is a really cool example. But there's other examples of famous Tony Rice licks too. So if you look at like the sort of the chorus section of that break, it's all alternate picked up, right? It's all alternate picked down. he starts doing the cross picking pattern, down, down, up. Right? So it's kind of like a mix. All just chords. Right? And then, flat picked again. So he is kind of like choosing his techniques. And it's not just in the Church Street Blues style. It's also in some of his like hot licks. He'll break pick stroke patterns. So for instance, this lick. Right? We've all kind of seen Tony do something like that, right? And the pattern is groups of three, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And instead of playing the correct alternate pick strokes, which would be down, up, down, down, up, down, right? He just plays down, up the whole time. Down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. Because in that lick, it kind of makes sense, right? If each one of these is like a 3-note chunk, why don't I use the same pick strokes for each segment of the pattern? And so Tony is willing to break the alternate picking, religion for these little licks, right? He's okay with that.
Well, it is a religion for sort of flat pick guitar, but you think about playing mandolin, and if you're going to play an Irish jig, which is all in threes, then it's often down, up, down, down, up, down, down, up, because that fits the rhythm of what you're trying to do, and it emphasizes the beats in the right place, and it's got that sort of bowing quality to it that you would get if you played on a fiddle. And so none of these, all of them are rules, and yet none of them are really rules. They're just conventions. Like we talked about arm placement before, and they're just they're techniques that work for most people, but they're there to be monkeyed with.
I think that one of the interesting things about Tony as a player is that sort of being top of the pile in the way he was, and I'm reading into this. Maybe this isn't how he felt at all, but looking at his catalog and knowing what I know about Tony and having read and seen what I've seen, I think that in certain ways he felt out-Tonied. And he certainly talks about that with the bluesy stuff, sort of that aggressive, competitive style that he had, early on. And he did it throughout his life, but, it's sort of the staple of his early playing, him playing like Freeborn Man. By the time Tony had been playing for a couple decades, there were lots of players doing that. And he says in an interview that he felt like there were people that were better at it than him, that there were people that did this aggressive, dramatic thing better than him. And so I think it led to this like constant reinvention. And so like Church Street Blues comes out. It's an album of solo guitar. There isn't really an aggressive lick in that. There's some moments that are like close, but that whole thing is pretty tame in terms of like the flat 5, flat 7, flat 3, like that whole kind of thing. He's playing pretty straight ahead, and he's still playing something that is very hard to replicate. And I think he reaches that point where people are starting to figure out Church Street Blues. And, in some of Tony's last outings, we see, this like third style crop up, which is the like chord melody bluegrass thing, how he plays Shenandoah, how he plays Dandy Boy. And that's kind of like, I think that's the last nut that's left to be cracked for Tony Rice. People ask me to transcribe those, by the way, and I always say no. Right? If someone's going to give that away to the world, it's not going to be me. Let Tony keep that one. And you look through his life and you see all of these like little reinventions and these little like additions to the Tony Rice style. We didn't even talk about the like Space Grass Tony Rice unit records, which is a whole other category that's very difficult to get into and understand the chord choices and the scale choices and stuff. But Tony is constantly like picking a new thing, so that way, the phony Tonys, the copycats can't keep up. And it's remarkable. And I truly think that no one has caught up with that Shenandoah. They even played it at IBMA. I think Chris Eldridge played it. at the IBMA thing. And it was a pretty good representation, but it didn't sound like Tony.
I think that was the first time I saw any video footage of Tony playing. I think it was at Grey Fox. There's a DVD called Bluegrass Journey, which I think is a documentary about Grey Fox, essentially. But it's full of performances. And it's just, and it's nighttime and Tony's just stood there, just him and that guitar. And in front of a festival audience where you could hear a pin drop and everybody's leaning in to hear, and he takes his time and he lets it breathe, and you there's times where it's such a familiar melody, but you don't necessarily know where the beat is or where the phrase. But they're just
free, yeah.
It's just phrases, and he decides how long a phrase needs to be, and then moves on to the next one, and it's an extraordinary thing.
Yeah, that particular recording, I think it's from the Bluegrass Journey documentary, and they show a bunch of that footage. Like all you can hear is the rain. It's raining like crazy, and you can hear like the crickets in the background, and then it's just Tony Rice's guitar, and there's tons of people watching, and you don't hear a peep from them. Everyone's just dead silent. It's just rain and Tony. It's crazy.
It's incredible. So I think that's probably I think we've covered. The one thing I was sort of going to say when we were talking about that, you were talking about the sort of the Tony clones, and it feels like there is a point where people just take that style of sort of chromatic, bluesy, hard driving stuff and slap it on everything. And sometimes I take fiddle tune like St. Anne's Reel that is all major scale, all the way through,
right.
Has a melody, has some lovely melodic major key qualities to it. And maybe people wouldn't do it over St. Anne's Reel, but you know where I'm going with it is that people take songs where that doesn't necessarily belong and just put it over everything. And it's become such a sort of stylistic choice.
Can I do the demo?
Yeah. Exactly that. And it's one of the things I sort of struggle with a little bit in my playing is that I tend to stick to major scales and I think I listen to myself and think, you don't sound that bluegrass, and it's because I'm so conditioned to hear some of those licks now as being what bluegrass guitar is, right. Such is the all-encompassing power of it.
Circling back on that conversation, isn't that what's interesting though, or like, isn't that what feels like something a virtuoso would do on those instruments, is to kind of tackle the thing that's difficult? So for instance, on the banjo, we said that this chord-based arpeggio play is, really what's kind of the instrument is made for. But you look at someone like Bela Fleck, plays a lot of single note lines. I feel like that's where you really get the gasps, right? You're like, whoa, because the instrument like doesn't do that, and he can make the instrument do that. That's what's shocking. Or you hear like fiddle players, their instrument really isn't a rhythm instrument. You can't play chords on the fiddle. Some people have really, really kind of acrobatic kind of chop moves that they do to create almost like a drum set on the fiddle. It's remarkable. So when you hear guitar players kind of avoid the bluesy thing and still nail a tune, like David Greer playing any of these fiddle tunes and avoiding the bluesy thing, but playing really dense, lush arrangements, I mean, that's beautiful. That's like, oh, you didn't take the easy way out. You could have just played blues, but you didn't. Yeah,
totally. And just it's and I guess basically what we've been talking about for all this time is style, and note choice is a big part of that, and tone is. And sometimes what you don't play is the choice you make, and like Miles Davis leaving space and everything. It's not the 1,000,001 notes you do play; it's the 3 you play, or the space you leave in Shenandoah, or it's all up for grabs. It's all there, and it's all those things that go to make style, which makes all 4 of these players so fascinating, and makes learning to be a musician and find what your thing is in amongst all of that a bit daunting and a bit sort of, but that's the journey, isn't it? It's to pick up all these things and then go, well, what do I sound like? Let's find out.
There are still ideas out there. I do those live transcription, sort of sessions where people suggest tunes, we transcribe things. And, a break came up, last night when we were doing one, and it just blew my mind. There's a bunch of note choice in there that I just would not expect. And the player's name was, Jeff Autry, I think. And, not a player I'm super familiar with. But there's a bunch of ideas in there that I was, a little flabbergasted by. And, sometimes you find those things and you're like, whoa, why doesn't anyone do that? It's crazy that it still exists, but yeah, there's still territory to be carved out. You just have to go find it. And, one of the easiest ways to find it is to explore all of the territory that has been carved out, right? You're like, oh, this is what Tony did. This is what Trey has done. This is what Billy has done. You look at all these famous players And then, sometimes a whole kind of reveals itself. You're like, oh, why didn't anyone make this choice? It's almost like, not to make a ham-fisted metaphor, but it's almost like chess. You can memorize a lot of chess openings. You can sort of get into the middle game by, playing whatever. And, playing the Italian or playing this defense or whatever. And if you watch professional games, they really don't play any standard openings, right? There may be some sort of inclination or reference to a standard opening move in chess, but almost immediately there's a bizarro move, and you're like, why? How? What are you seeing that I don't see? And it's that same kind of thing, right? You can find that choice that will throw people off.
Mm. Yeah, and that's what, this is what we want out of music. We want enough familiar stuff that we can find something to listen to, and we want enough unfamiliar stuff within that to make it interesting and take our ear somewhere we hadn't quite expected it was going to.
Chris Thiele said that he likes to shock you. He wants you to feel like you're falling off a cliff, but when you hit the bottom of the cliff, you land on a pillow. And I thought that was a nice way of saying it. Like, he wants to shock you, but he lets you know it's all okay, right? Still music.
Yeah. Because if all you're doing is shocking people, they're not going to come back.
Yeah, right.
Brilliant. Well, that's such a cool discussion. I can imagine, let alone anybody else listening to this, me going back and listening to this again and getting more out of it. It's an absolute pleasure to chat to you again. Thanks so much for coming on.
No, it's been lovely being here. Have me back soon.
Anytime. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.